conversation. Yeah, this is one of those being human tracks. I've been part of the Drupal community for 12 plus years. Some of you may have seen this talk before. I've continuously updated, and yeah, the goal today is really to share with you some of the research and experience that I've kind of gone through over the last maybe 8 years, talking about diversity, being proud of the word, trying to have, good faith conversations with folks. And the ultimate goal today is to share with all of you not only those findings, but hopefully you can pull some things away so that you can continue to and further the conversation within your teams and within your environment. I put the slides up on the page, so if you want to download them via PDF, you can. You can also go to this URL if you just want to follow them live, but obviously you can also grab it from the screen too. All right, so we're going to start off with just a quick little game. You don't necessarily need to jump in via mic, but just kind of maybe play this along on your head. So a young woman was 3 years old when she started to read books. So start there. So I ask you the question, what is her college GPA? You've got a variety of different options. So just take 10 seconds, kind of look at the options, kind of put a mental picture in your head, and think about, how would you kind of come to the conclusion that you think would be the best guess answer? So you've got your answer. So the key is that this is a little bit of a gotcha question. And basically what I want to show here is that there really is no way to know. But the way that we think about those shortcuts, how we take information from a small portion of a piece that we know about a person and then try to extrapolate that over to a larger portion, that's technically, what bias is. It's obviously used in a negative context, but it also can be used positively. And it's one of those mechanisms biologically that we as human beings have in order to make sense of the world. So in this case, the real thing I wanted you to take away with is that there really isn't a way to avoid bias or to be better at it than others. I think sometimes as engineers, and especially within a tech space, we try to convince ourselves that we're dispassionate and that we're fair because we have maybe a higher technical acuity. And so some of the things we may read about, our biases, our isms, our stereotypes, maybe we're not subject to that because we're enlightened. And the key thing I want to kind of take away from this is that even in the most innocuous example where you're trying to guess what someone's GPA is based on the fact that they started reading at 3 years old, that's just a natural human tendency to create those biases. So the first hypothesis that I want to kind of start with, that I want you to think about as we're having our discussion today, is this idea that within the world of tech, although we tend to focus a lot on technical ability, ultimately what will make the world a better place is requiring that the folks who are building this technology not only do it in an equitable way, as in making it accessible to as many people as possible. Whoops, sorry about that. Go back. But also the fact that we want to make sure that people develop what's called emotional intelligence. And with those two things together, that's what's ultimately going to make technology work for everyone and make it as interoperable as possible, being able to connect, disparate systems. What's interesting about this hypothesis is that I made this hypothesis probably 6 or 7 years ago, maybe even 8 years ago. We lived in a different world. We had different government institutions. We had a different kind of stock market, even to a certain degree. And obviously, with the continuation of all the things that we've seen, it's been interesting kind of seeing how this hypothesis a little bit come into fruition. But I'm hopeful that with our conversation today, you can kind of see how we can pull these ideas together and ultimately kind of have this conversation amongst all of us, not just a few of us. All right, so sorry, I'm using my phone here to navigate. That's why a little bit awkward. All right. So the first thing we want to talk about is we want to kind of establish some more definitions of terms. That way, when I use these terms, And ultimately, when hopefully you can use these terms when you're talking amongst your teams and in your network, we're all on the same page. So the first is perspective. Perspective is how you typically look at a problem, and common perspectives come from imitation. So you can use an example as, how would we solve this problem within Drupal? Oh, we should use paragraphs module. Why would you think that? Well, my perspective is that I've seen, other sites use that and it works pretty well. Perspective is really important because it helps you communicate, especially within a group, and it helps you make you feel comfortable. The next term we want to kind of focus on is something called heuristic. And heuristic is how you typically search for a solution. So while your perspective may be the information that you already have and things that your experience, things that you've been exposed to kind of come to a conclusion, your heuristic is, think about it as, what are the tools or what are the mechanisms that I use to go and actually search for that solution? So do I, go into Google? Do I just ask people that I really trust? Do I, go to a certain book? Do I want to talk to a specific expert, that kind of thing? Let's kind of take these two things and go into a specific example. In the 1930s, there was a farmer found one of his calves were sick on his farm. And what he ended up finding was that the calf had been eating clovers in the field, and it was ultimately kind of making the calf sick. And one of the byproducts of eating a clover is something called coumarin, which they found out was actually thinning the calf's blood. And the idea was that how do we get rid of this, and how could this be used moving forward? It just so happens that a scientist who was also working with this farmer happened to be doing some experiments with rat poison and going through all these kind of different scientific breakthroughs. And they ended up kind of repurposing that idea of something that was poisonous to animals and actually used it for one of the most biggest life-saving drugs next to penicillin called Coumadin. This ultimately kind of manufactured itself 40 years later, but Coumadin is actually a blood thinning agent. It saved a lot of people's lives, but it took a really long time for that type of innovation to happen, mainly because the heuristic that came from the person who was trying to solve a different problem, in this case, the agricultural farmer, it didn't really, translate into the broader scientific community, into a person who with a different heuristic was able to repurpose that perspective, for a different reason. So it's just one of those examples of how, different people's perspectives of farmers and trying to solve something for their calf can actually be repurposed depending upon the different heuristics, the different perspectives of the people that you're actually engaging with. One more quick example. So when scientists, it's back in, the 20s and 30s when we would teach science of how eggs are fertilized and how the reproductive system works, we would often use this image, this idea that when sperm fertilize an egg, it's battle of the fittest, and one sperm kind of makes it, and that's ultimately what happens. Well, as the scientific community matured and women were allowed to practice science and were more accepted in science, it turns out that this is not an accurate depiction of how the reproductive cycle actually works. It's actually more something like this, where mini sperm actually make it, I would say, or at least approach the egg for fertilization. And it ended up changing our entire understanding of just the reproductive system in general. And again, the goal here is to reinforce specific examples of the difference and the importance of perspective and heuristic, right? If you have an environment that it's not inclusive of a variety of different perspectives, then the heuristic that you use to kind of come to conclusions and come up with solutions, you may miss bigger parts of, the ultimate reality and what facts are. And even in the case of, scientists and engineers who feel like they are emotionless or they don't, have bias brought into them, these are two specific examples, and there are many others where the human race is actually jump leaps and bounds because we've included a lot more perspectives into looking at the problem, as well as the fact that we've included a lot more folks with different heuristics to able to solve that problem. All right, so now we can kind of transition to another concept of your team, maybe the team you work with or the team you're building, especially if you're a business owner. And one of the things that's often, that at least when I talk to team owners or team leads or business owners, is this idea that they believe the people that they've hired are probably the best, that their team is full of superheroes. And what's interesting about that particular perspective is, when you talk about diversity or you ask them about diversity, there's a lot of different almost mental gymnastics that go into defining what diversity is, right? So you've got something called demographic diversity. And so this is the things that we typically see. Our gender, our race, our sexual orientation, things of that nature, things that are outwardly facing, things that people can typically kind of see or you've shared in an outward manner about who you are. You also have something called experiential diversity. And this is, again, thinking back to our definition of perspective and heuristic, these are the things that we ultimately involve what we experience, right? So these are our hobbies. So people who do different things in their own time. These are maybe the groups or associations we decide to affiliate with. So these are our affinities. And then also our experience can also be based on our abilities too. So, if you have a lot of experience, if you, maybe new, if you've maybe grew up with English wasn't your first language, those are the kind of things that, those particular experiences are ultimately going to reflect, your perspective and your heuristic. And then you've also got something called cognitive diversity. And this seems to be more of a popular and safer term when we talk about diversity. And ultimately, this is, again, how we approach problems and how we think about things. This is really kind of going deeper into perspective and heuristic. And a lot of times when we talk about diversity, we tend to shy away from demographic diversity. We want to almost dismiss it to a certain degree. I almost titled this talk, how to answer the question of why should I care about race or why should I care about gender when hiring people? But as those conversations kind of blossom out, it typically kind of devolves into kind of these cognitive diversity examples, and why can't we just use that instead of the other ones? I think the most important thing to take away from is that, like many things in this world, this is a very fluid kind of concept. And this classification, these three classifications, again, is just used so that we can have a conversation. But I think the most important thing is to remember that oversimplifying either one of these or trying to pit one against each other is typically where you're going to run into trouble. But it's good to understand, how they can be broken down. The parallel here, when we talk about the complexity of the idea of diversity, whether it's demographic, experiential, or cognitive, is we see this in kind of biological terms all the time. There's the idea that we live in a world that's full of biodiversity. And through the theory of evolution, we know that a lot of animals and species need to constantly change and in order to survive. And one of the things that drives that change is the diversity of the biology and the ecosystems they live in. The example that you're looking at is a kind of a typical example of, the slippery tongue of a frog, how slippery a frog's tongue is, and how slippery the body of maybe an insect, right? So you can imagine within the evolutionary world, the biological world, a particular bug or insect may develop a gene where their body is a lot more slippery, and therefore they may not necessarily be caught as often as maybe some of their counterparts. As they continuously maybe thrive a little bit more, they end up reproducing a lot more, and the ones who don't develop that particular affinity end up dying off. The same is true for frogs and that balance, right? If you're trying to catch prey that has a slipperier body and you don't develop maybe a stickier tongue, then as you pass those genes down and as you engage more with different species, you know, you may not develop that particular affinity, and your particular species or your particular kind of genealogical line may die off as compared to, you know, the other species of frogs who've developed maybe a stickier tongue. And when you think about that holistically, what really is happening is this idea that in order for us to survive, or in order for our teams and our companies and our people to survive, we have to be constantly in an ever-changing environment. We have to be presented with challenges so that we are constantly evolving and are able to adjust to those new realities as possible. So that's kind of that parallel that I want to make sure that is kind of stuck in there too, especially when we're trying to think of, you know, is this a real thing, and is this something that, you know, is the idea of diversity in this conversation just, you know, these human-created concepts, psychological concepts? And basically what I'm positing here is that if you really think about it in terms of the parallel of biology and science, the value of diversity is definitely tied to survival to a certain degree. So now we end up moving into the allegory of Star Trek. And, you know, I'm a big Star Trek fan. And one of the things that I'm sure a lot of Star Trek fans probably notice is the fact that I didn't jump to Star Trek Next Generation or Deep Space Nine, that I ended up going to Voyager. For those who don't know about the Voyager kind of backstory, it was set in the 2730s. And what was interesting about the premise of this particular show was that it was made up of a hodgepodge crew that was ultimately thrown 70,000 light years away from Earth. There's a lot of different factions from the crew. You had people who were traditionally Starfleet. You had those who were actually fighting Starfleet, the Maquis rebels, who were actually trying to, you know, declare some sort of independence. And because there were spies on the ship at the time when this whole kind of calamity ensued, you ended up having essentially a ragtag crew who had to adapt to a lot of challenging situations, ultimately going towards the same goal, which is how do we get back to the Alpha Quadrant and Earth in general. The other great thing about this particular show in terms of its allegory is that it was one of the first, if not the first, Star Trek, but even the scientific world to have a woman captain. And at that time, and I know it seems kind of cliche, but you got to think back, this was about 30 years ago. At that time, that was a very kind of groundbreaking kind of decision that was made by Gene Roddenberry and the rest of the production crew to kind of move this forward. And I thought that was really powerful as well. So as we kind of go into this allegory, and we talk about diversity, we put down some ideas with perspective and heuristic. We've talked about, you know, evolution and biology, and we've talked about how we kind of have naturally these biases. Now we're kind of moving into, you know, our different roles. And the first role that makes the most sense is, right, the captain of the ship, the person who's maybe in charge of the team, the person who is leading the team, building the team, and the allegory here is Captain Janeway. For some of the younger folks who are listening to this, they probably are thinking, well, isn't this the person from Orange is the New Black? And the answer is yes. Kate Mulgrew, in her previous acting life, was Captain Janeway in Star Trek Voyager for 7 seasons. And she's a very powerful character. Again, as I mentioned before, her job within the show was to meld together a lot of different perspectives, a lot of hostile perspectives together to kind of go down and solve the problem of not only keeping the crew together and surviving, but making their way back. And one of her kind of endearing traits that was written into her character was the fact that she was extremely stubborn, that as she was pursuing to ultimately getting her crew back, she was constantly curious because she had a scientific background as kind of a researcher. And she ultimately knew that at the end of the day, she had to think out of the box and think about things differently in order to accomplish that, again, very complicated goal of kind of getting the crew back. And one of the things that, you know, she kind of talked about, which I think, you know, we can all kind of take away from, is that when you're kind of building a team, and especially when you're trying to build a team from a lot of different perspectives, you want to make sure that, you know, you're constantly supporting those individuals, right? So you want to keep your shirt tucked in, and no matter what happens, you go down with the ship and you never abandon a member of your crew. And again, the idea here is that in order to really bring everyone's perspective in and for everyone to feel valued, as the team lead, as the business owner, you know, you have to be almost, think of it almost like an inverted pyramid or inverted triangle. The leader should be at the bottom, and everyone else should be, you know, be supported by their actions. And so it leads to the question, right? When you think about, again, the fluidity of diversity and the things we've kind of talked about, if you're ultimately making those decisions, the question you need to ask yourself is, you know, are you open to being unorthodox? And here's where we kind of talk about, okay, what do we mean by unorthodox, and what are some of the things that I should be thinking about when evaluating these things? So let's go back into our kind of vocabulary world again, and we'll talk about two concepts. We have IQ, which I think most people have heard of, intelligence quotient, and then we have EQ, which is our emotional quotient or our emotional intelligence. One measures kind of our cognitive ability, and the other one measures, you know, our response and our perception of emotions. IQ is mainly about your ability to learn, not necessarily what you know, right? So the rapidity of how you can pick up new concepts. So when you talk about someone who has a very high IQ, it's really about, you know, how quickly can they, you know, absorb new things. Whereas EQ is really about, you know, what is your ability to recognize your own emotions as well as others. So if we go back to that first slide, you know, that little game that we played at the beginning, you'll remember that at the end of the day, you can't avoid emotion. You can't avoid bias. It's not possible. It's something that human beings have developed over time for our survival, for our fight and flight mechanism. So they're equally important, but I just want to make sure that I know a lot of times when we talk about emotions, people think, well, I'm not emotional. I don't get emotional or things of that nature. But it, you know, if you really think about it, it's really about, you know, have you developed a sense of perceiving what your emotions are and what other people's emotions are at that time, even if it's something you necessarily don't want to constantly be worried about. The other interesting thing to contrast about IQ and EQ is the fact that your IQ really doesn't change much after your childhood, whereas your EQ is something that constantly changes over time, something you can constantly be working on, you know, throughout your entire life. And I find that really, really comforting when we think about, you know, adapting to new situations. So one of the things that I'll be also sharing, you know, because we talked about not only math, science, and Star Trek, but science in general, is research. There's a lot of different studies that have shown that, and this one I'm particularly focusing on is from Harvard Business Review from 2001, that when we talk about groups in general, you know, when you talk about creativity and productivity, collaboration, cooperation, participation are really important. And to achieve those high levels of those particular things, a team has to have a greater emotional intelligence than necessarily individual intelligence. Ultimately, what they have found is that team members who have a high emotional intelligence amongst each other generally create a greater sense of trust. There's a better sense of group identity. And ultimately, you know, the goal, again, when we think about a group performing together, you know, a group of team members creating a project, delivering something for a customer, that trust among members, that idea that we're in this together, and the fact that we can work well together, you know, ultimately is what created a top performing group. And that kind of makes sense, right? And at the heart of those things, and you probably can all think of situations that, you know, reflect this, is the ability for it to be heard, the fact that, you know, that you feel like other people are listening, and those technical abilities, while they're good, you know, if you have a bunch of people with technical abilities, but they can't really engage and work with each other, then the efficacy of that group typically tends to suffer. And this is just kind of some scientific psychological research that underpins this idea that emotional intelligence is really important in terms of, you know, having a high performing group. All right, so we've painted the idea that as a leader, I have to be unorthodox in new concepts. We've introduced the concept of IQ and EQ. So now we're going to go to another character, one of my personal favorites, who's Tuvok. Tuvok is from the Vulcan race. And for those who are not familiar with Vulcans, essentially, I think the best way to think about them, they're almost like human beings at an extremely hyper-evolved state. So they typically live 300 to 400 years. They've removed kind of all emotions from their decision making. They're extremely logical creatures. And they specifically focus on peace through wisdom, experience, and vitality. What's interesting about Tuvok's character is that he would constantly reinforce, again, within the show, that even though he may not have been emotional as the situation may have called for, given the complexity of where the crew was during their journey, that doesn't necessarily mean that it wasn't difficult. And having composure doesn't necessarily equivocate to the fact that something is easy. And I think the lesson here is, ultimately, when we run into issues, right, when we have different perspectives, when we're trying to develop our emotional intelligence, when we're confronted with people from different heuristics, are we using a logical path to really kind of understand how to evaluate that and how to make, our team higher performing? To ask ourselves the question, what is the logical solution, to move past this? And, I think this is something that we as a community tend to try to do our best at. But again, if we're not tied into our emotions, if we're not tied into the perception of other emotions, simply constantly reaffirming and reinforcing this idea that we need to be logical doesn't really get us too far. So again, when we're thinking about working in groups, whether it's, the Drupal community, whether it's, a conference planning community, whether it's, you're in a small team, or a larger team, typically, if you think about, and especially if you work at different places, when you think about why you've left a place, why that wasn't a team a good fit, it's not necessarily because, most of the time, it's not because you just think, you were smarter than everyone else, or, those people were just incompetent, or they didn't have the technical ability, or they didn't know how to solve problems. It was mainly because, they felt like, people typically feel like, was I heard? Did I have the ability to grow? If I had particular types of feedback, or if I pushed back on things, was my team receptive to my perspective? So now we get into even more research. And I think, the headline here, as you can see, is that there is some research that has a correlation, not necessarily causation. We don't want to get into the correlation causation fallacy. And again, the other thing I'll note is that this particular piece of research just particularly focused on people who identified as women. So it was a very binary type of research. But I think the key here is there was some groundbreaking research that really talked about that having women as part of your team is key to having quote unquote smart teams. This idea that, there's a high correlation between if teams have more women members and, that group's emotional intelligence. And again, the idea is not to sort of imply that women don't have high IQs, that the idea that men don't have high EQs. And again, this is where, as we're having this conversation, we want to be careful of jumping into our own biases and trying to read too much into what's going on. The idea really is just kind of saying, based on this preliminary research, there's a high correlation between having kind of gender diversity, demographic diversity within a team, which could ultimately, again, going back to the fluidity of diversity, can have a high correlation to that particular group having a high emotional intelligence, people feeling like the group has a higher satisfaction rate, there's a higher set of cohesion, and they feel more motivated. So again, this is just kind of placing this kind of mile marker here to say, as we go deeper into understanding the importance of perspective and heuristic, as we go deeper into the science of what does diversity mean and what are the different types, and as we kind of look for what is the research saying in order to have these performant teams, having some sort of gender diversity, focusing on that demographic diversity, does have some high correlations to high group output. And what's interesting is that anytime I bring this up, it's usually at a tech conference with a lot of guys. And ultimately, whether it's, during the talk or after the talk or even questions afterwards, right? There's this kind of conversation of, why is this important? Why is it that there's some sort of correlation between someone's gender and high efficacy of groups? And I just thought this comic was a good kind of representation of that. One of the things that's kind of obvious about this is the fact that in our biases and in things, especially if you identify as a man, and if you're a heterosexual cisgendered man, we tend to not necessarily be cognizant of our blind spots. We tend to think that, again, that we're able to think logically, and that we don't present emotion to anything, and that our perspective and our worldview ultimately has worked so far. So why should we consider these things that may necessarily things that we can benefit from? And again, this comic is just one of those kind of funny things where if you're not able to be cognizant of another person's perspective and heuristic, you'll just kind of miss the obvious answer of how that particular person's experience and diversity kind of can bring new perspective and new heuristics to our group, and ultimately make our group great. So then you ultimately ask the question, if there's some kind of underlying research of these teams and how they compete against each other, and this particular research that I pulled up was kind of just kind of mixing up the genders as necessary. The question becomes, well, why do diverse teams maybe outperform, and what are those conditions that exist in order for that to happen? And there's a couple of things that kind of came out of this that I thought was really important to share with the group. The first is that typically when you're around people who maybe not necessarily sharing the same affinities or have different experiences, you tend to want to focus on facts. You don't jump to wanting to please that person so much. You don't necessarily, blend into the majority think, and that idea of really focusing on facts and trying to have factual discussions, tends to alter the behavior of the group, especially if there's a social majority, right? If there's someone who's maybe there's a lot of native English speakers, or from a particular school, or things of that nature. The other thing is that, again, this is just kind of a natural thing that we do as human beings, is that when you're in a team that's surrounded by people who are a little bit different than you, you tend to be a little bit more careful in terms of what things are presented. So you process those facts a little bit more carefully, because again, it's just a natural kind of bias that you have, is that the information that you're receiving, you may kind of, again, not in a negative sense, and maybe not a malicious sense, but you tend to maybe give less benefit of the doubt, and so you tend to process those facts carefully. You may do your own research, and again, that ultimately has kind of a good benefit to those teams overall, because as ideas are turned over and as you talk a lot more, you end up getting more innovation, and you dodge these costly pitfalls that come from kind of a group think, from not wanting to upset the apple cart, things of that nature. So that kind of leads me to my bold statement number one, to all the folks who who have braved kind of my ramblings up to this point. And that's this idea that at the end of the day, there's no such thing as common sense. Common sense kind of implies, that there's a common perspective, that we all kind of come from, similar experiences. And I really would push back, when you're in these conversations about the importance of diversity, and trying to, put value on these things, the conversation tends to devolve into, well, that doesn't make sense. That doesn't make any common sense. This just makes common sense. Why wouldn't we just kind of do this thing? And again, it kind of papers over this idea that there may be a blind spot there, that what you may find common is not necessarily something that I would find common. And do we have a team that can process those uncommon kind of perspectives? So now we go into our next character with Star Trek, and this is Torres. She was the chief engineer on the ship, and she was also a groundbreaking character for a lot of different reasons. One, in other shows, the chief engineer was typically a man, so the fact that we had a woman playing this character was also really great and cool. She was also half Hispanic in terms of her human side, and she was also half Klingon. So there was a lot of storylines that kind of wrapped around identity and her struggle with identity, which I thought was really kind of groundbreaking. Again, this was 30 years ago, so this I thought was really interesting. And because of that, she always kind of had this tough facade. She always was trying to prove herself. She was extremely knowledgeable and had a lot of talent, but sometimes her perspective, her sense of honor and guilt, and tenacity kind of threw people off. And yet, despite that, Captain Janeway made her the chief engineer. And she would say things like, if I sprain my ankle, at least I know I'm feeling something. Obviously, I'm not trying to kill myself, I'm just trying to see if I'm still alive. And if you ever kind of worked with, folks who kind of had this type of, zealot kind of nature, where they're super passionate about a particular project, they're super passionate about a particular subject, you can know that can kind of be off-putting. But at the same time, as a good leader, you want to bring that person in. You want to put them in a position where they can be successful. So that ultimately, her character kind of ultimately asks the question, right? How am I evaluating talent? How am I thinking about the people who I quote unquote would be good for this team, or who would fit, in our particular organization? One book that you can think about or look at, and one book that I kind of read and really kind of did a deep dive on, is something called The Difference. And it was written by Professor Scott Page. He is a professor of complex systems and political science and economics. And what's great about his book is that he really kind of unpacked this question that typically kind of comes up when we talk about diversity, which is, well, I just want to hire the most qualified. Again, what's kind of implied, whether you see it or not, in this kind of statement when these questions come up, is, well, how do you define most qualified, right? So when we think about the person in charge or that team, right, you're going to use natural biases because of what you're comfortable with to say, based on my experience and based on what I've seen, most qualified to me means, this particular perspective, or they talk this way, or they've done these X number of things. And again, when we think about a character like B'Elanna Torres, who not only was not part of Starfleet at the time, has a very brash personality, but was extremely talented. When we think about how we evaluate that talent, we have to be cognizant of what are those things that we're bringing with us to say, this is how we think what most qualified is, right? The other thing you can do is almost invert the question, right? If the criteria that I use to define most qualified is tried and true, let's just say that answer is, how many Drupal modules has that person contributed? Then it would beg the question, okay, so are the people who have contributed lots of Drupal modules, have they never been fired? Because if they're the ones who are most qualified, then ultimately, right, then those should be the best team members. And we can probably think of examples where that probably just isn't true. So again, we have to be careful when we put too much weight on our specific biases. And again, how we bring our own kind of experience into how we evaluate and look at others. Right? So this is, again, going back to our vocabulary words. What is the perspective that I use to kind of think about the problem? And what are the answers that I go to kind of find that solution, right? Do I just go to the same 2 or 3 people to say, well, what do you think? Do I use that same sheet? Do I use from that same school? Do I just talk to the same people? Do I compare them to the same things that I've always compared to? And how do I make sure that I'm not introducing risk into my business, into my team, by basically, kind of going to the same well of logic when it comes to evaluating team folks? So it goes to my next bold statement, which is, you must change your perspective to arrive at a new heuristic, right? So in order to really kind of find new solutions and to pull in different people who have different perspectives, you have to almost change your perspective. And when you do this, when you change your perspective, when you surround yourself and do unorthodox things to really think about how you're evaluating things, and you arrive at a new heuristic, there's a word for that in our industry, and it's called innovation, right? When we think about the most innovative products, we think about them from the perspective of, wow, I didn't really think about that they could, approach it that way. When we think about, new solutions, they're typically because new perspectives, a diverse set of perspectives, maybe a new set of context was added, and a new way of thinking about the solution kind of came through. And what's interesting about this idea of innovation is that even the most innovative companies, right, still have these blind spots where it's very obvious that even when they came out with something that was likely world-changing, there were still some gaps, right? So there are a couple of examples of this. when Ambien first kind of came out, the way that they actually tested Ambien during these trials, instead of testing it on women, they just decided, well, we don't need to diversify our testing pool. We'll just find other men who are just smaller in stature, and that'll be the same with women, right? And they ended up having some issues when it came to dosing parameters and its effectiveness on women. When iPhone and Apple Health Kit first came out, you know, it was deemed as this really innovative thing, this idea that, you know, you could track your pulse and your and you know, all these different aspects about your health. But when it was first launched, you know, it had no period tracking. And it could be questioned to say, okay, how is it that something that's supposedly, you know, the most innovative, you know, health kind of technological revolution that came through almost excluded half the world's population for something that's not only happens, you know, to almost every person who identifies as a woman, but also something that's just very natural and very biological. Like, how could that be skipped? How innovative really is that? And that could, you know, obviously lead to the questions of, you know, well, how diverse was that team? The same is true for Harvard, as you probably saw in the news last year, in terms of how they, you know, did their admission practices. You know, they try to tout themselves as, you know, bringing on the best and the brightest, yet 40% of the people that they actually accept are just legacy, you know, families. And even the same is true for, you know, maybe your Facebook newsfeed. The fact that you have this kind of curated list of, you know, things, but we've seen the evidence of, even though this idea of the newsfeed was innovative and it changed the way people consume information, because it reinforced people's biases and their bubbles, right? You now have rampant misinformation. And obviously with the state of today we live in, you know, we can see how dangerous that actually is when you don't actually diversify your perspectives and actually, you know, don't bring in a lot of different perspectives and heuristic in terms of how you consume information. So again, this is asking the question, how do you specifically define most qualified? What are the things you're bringing in? And how do you define what qualified is? Last but not least, in terms of the character we want to kind of explore, is a character called 7 of 9. 7 of 9 was half human and half Borg on the show. For those who aren't familiar, Borg was actually was a very kind of interesting race of beings on the show. I think they kind of, you know, spoke to kind of this larger context of a lot of the biases and blind spots that we have as human beings. Essentially, the Borg was this race of beings that assimilated other cultures. They basically stated that they were going to assimilate other cultures, take the best and most qualified aspects of that culture and assimilate them into their collective, and essentially be the superior race of all beings in the universe. That was their philosophy, that they would come from a central hive mind, and as long as everyone did exactly what they were told and kind of plugged into the quote unquote matrix, that every time we assimilated a new culture, that we would take the best of that culture, distribute it amongst all of our members, and essentially just kind of, you know, be the best race of beings in existence. What was interesting about 7 of 9's character was that because she was half Borg and half human, she was constantly battling these kind of two philosophies. This idea that I want to be the best and I want to use logic and, you know, the best mechanisms to solve every problem, but also her human side of being emotional, being, you know, trying to figure out more complex things. And when her character was introduced in the 4th season, you know, viewership skyrocketed. It introduced kind of a new plot line and a new kind of tension on the show, which is really, really interesting. One of her favorite sayings, anytime the crew would kind of talk about various options when it came to trying to get back home and solve the problem of returning to Earth, you know, whether they would, you know, especially when people get emotional about the various options, whether they should take, you know, this path or not this path, she would always chime in and say, you know, well, emotion is irrelevant. That's irrelevant. And I find that that's something that tends to happen in these conversations about diversity, that we tend to be more Borg-like, We typically and quickly dismiss things that we don't understand. Someone's demographic diversity, we say that, well, why is someone's race or their gender, or the fact that, they may speak a different, why does that matter? That doesn't seem like that would really make sense. And again, what's really powerful about her character is that over time, she realizes that discounting or dismissing or even discrediting these ideas about what make us human and not acknowledging them actually puts us off in a worse position. Because ultimately, again, we live in a very complex and dynamic world, full of fluidity. Things change all the time. And if we're not constantly adapting and we're not constantly aware of all those different perspectives, then we'll ultimately we won't be able to achieve, our goal. And so that kind of leads the question, right, of, Fredric, you're telling me all these different things. I understand that these particular concepts, but ultimately, why should I care? It sounds like it's a good thing to have, and maybe it's something that makes me feel good. But if I don't do these things, why does that matter? If our team, if our company, if we don't really bring into heart, these concepts you're talking about, what's the worst case that could happen? 6 years ago, that was a really hard question to answer. But I think as we've seen in this world, when you're surrounded by people who you just want to think like you, or who are constantly just kind of from the same perspective, right, you can have dire consequences, right? And typically people do things out of 4 different reasons. Usually for vanity, they want to look good. Virtue, they want, to be morally kind of fulfilled. Out of fear, right? They're afraid of, giant risk. And then ultimately kind of profit. How do we make money from it, right? I think the key that we need to kind of focus on is this idea that fear and profit are very powerful motivators. So when we talk about diversity, and if you're in your team and you're trying to push the idea of diversity, be cognizant of those things. Let's kind of go deeper into kind of a little bit of the science and a particular theorem posited by Professor Page. As I'm kind of winding down on my 10 minutes here, and we'll kind of get through this. There's this theorem of, diversity trumps ability. But there are certain conditions in order for this theorem to be true. The problem must be very, very hard, right? So it's not something that can be easily solved. Each solver has a local optima to the problem. So this idea that each individual person has their own unique ability of how they can solve it, right? So you may have like the best farmer, the best scientist, the best actor, that kind of stuff. An improvement can be made to a non-optimal solution. So this is idea that an improvement can always be made. We can always live in a better society. This problem can always be improved upon. It doesn't have like a finite kind of solved end. When those conditions are met, in addition to the fact that there's a large pool of talent or a large pool of solvers, then it posits that this theorem actually makes sense, right? That the diversity will always trump kind of just individual ability. And when we think about that, right, again, we have these biological parallels that, if I'm constantly trying to eat better as a frog and I want to get better, right, the more experiences, the more kind of biodiversity that I'm in, the fact there's a lot of different, ways to do it, a lot of different sizes of frog, a lot of different kind of tongues. I'm using this analogy kind of moving forward, right? We can kind of see how this theorem kind of fits. What's interesting about this theorem is that it can be expressed mathematically as well. That this can actually be modeled to be proven, given certain conditions, that diversity does actually trump ability. And what you're actually looking at is the fact that the accuracy of predicting something, of predicting an outcome, right, is the ability minus the difference in the categories that the individuals create in order to try to solve that particular, problem. So this idea that, we can mathematically model the fact that diversity would trump ability given certain conditions almost moves the needle past the idea of diversity being this kind of feel-good thing, and actually moves it into almost, a mathematical type of certainty similar to Pythagoras, that no, in certain conditions, if we're trying to actually survive, if we're trying to actually profit, we need to be really cognizant, and we need to take this as almost fact. Because there's a lot of evidence around us, as well as mathematical models that reinforce this idea that, in order to get the most accurate kind of prediction, our ability to do those things is important, but it's going to be handicapped if everyone in our team is coming from the same perspective to kind of present that particular heuristic. Like any other scientific, position, you want to obviously read kind of counter opinions, and there's also, counter to those counter opinions. And so, I will encourage you, if you really want to kind of get deep into the math and the science, to kind of go deeper into those particular scientific papers. But I think the most important thing is that when we think about this conversation of diversity, we want to have these particular mental models in our head. So then that way we can have fruitful conversations with our teams. We can talk about and maybe, center this conversation on maybe some science and mathematical foundation, but really kind of come down into this idea that, we need to think of people as collections of tools, right? A hammer and a screwdriver is not going to be able to solve everything. And when we think about it that way, someone's individual ability is actually a reflection of their applicability of those particular tools, which means that when we're solving very complex problems, like trying to build platforms for an entire department, or trying to, revamp the workflows of an internal tool set, all these things that Drupal is used for, whether it's trying to consume disparate types of information for public consumption, right? The unique abilities and perspectives of different types of people, you want to collect as many tools as possible so that ultimately you can apply those tools to as many different situations as possible. And I think kind of adopting this model helps you kind of understand where diversity kind of meets the road past the kind of the moral argument, which leads me to my third bold statement, right? At the end of the day, we have to, especially as a community, as an organization, we hear this idea of pipeline problem. It's not necessarily an issue, and even the idea of a pipeline is this idea that there's some sort of, there's log jam or there's not enough kind of flowing through. I think ultimately what needs to happen is we need to really think about how we incentivize, bringing in diversity, right? So what are some of the things that we can do? As we think about that, here's an example of why this is so important. What you're looking at is actually carabiners. So a carabiner, for those who don't know, is a device that you use to tie things down. So if you're a rock climber and you're trying to connect, your rope to your harness and connect it to another, maybe a lever or pulley, use a carabiner to kind of do that. What's interesting about this picture is that all three of these things are actually carabiners. The first one is designed by a human being, right? So you have the perspective of how a human would design a carabiner, it's very obvious. The second is actually designed by artificial intelligence. So they take all of the kind of, perspectives of different human beings and decide, this was the most efficient design. And the third one is actually an AI designed carabiner, but 3D printed. And so what's interesting about this is that even though they all serve the same purpose, right? The second one is actually 75% lighter than the first one. And the third one is actually 50% lighter than the second one. But as human beings, even though they logically all do the same thing, it may not be obvious based on how we think about what carabiners should look like, that these are all efficient and great solutions to ultimately that problem, right? And so problem solvers with diverse perspectives, right? When we think about bringing in all those different perspectives and the idea that, we have this kind of mathematical foundation of having these different perspectives, the one thing you'll probably run into is this idea that when you have a lot of perspective, it's sometimes hard to understand, where other people are coming from. So how do you get past that? And that's where the importance of EQ kind of comes back into play, right? This idea that when you're having trouble engaging with others, if you've never been around other people who have different perspectives, focusing on your EQ, focusing on your emotional intelligence is ultimately going to help you, be aware of people's perspectives, and ultimately going to help you, make the team more efficient. And we've seen that in the correlative studies that I showed earlier, right? And ultimately, what we're trying to do is we're trying to figure out how do we find those targets? How do we find those people? How can we become geniuses? How can we find things, right, that we ultimately can't see? Because from our perspective, we can only see so much. So some things that we can do, right? So one thing we can kind of believe these particular perspectives. Diversity is a fact. It's not one of those things that it would be nice to have. We live in a diverse world, whether you believe that or not, that's just a fact. How you choose to include those perspectives is a practice, and it requires practice. But ultimately, the goal is to be equitable, right? We want to create a society, institution, and your teams and all these different places where people can feel like they can contribute. Because if everyone contributes, then we ultimately grow the pie. We ultimately have all these different perspectives and heuristics to solve a variety of different problems, and we can be in a better place, right? So I want to quickly kind of show this graph, because typically this conversation, when we talk about equity and we talk about kind of pushing this idea, folks typically want to kind of stay in the middle, right? They want to be neutral. And the problem with that is, we've seen that in the past, what happens when you kind of split the line. If you're not necessarily negative, you don't necessarily, aren't against it, but you're probably not going to do anything for it, but you're not really pushing towards integration. And inertia will eventually kind of pull us into segregated spaces. We're seeing that already, right? When fear is used to divide us and things of that nature, we typically kind of go back into our own little holes. Whereas if we push to grow and we use our privilege to help others, right, we can avoid things like oppressing perspectives. We can avoid things like, not including different folks in their positions. So how do we grow? For your team, make sure you have SMART goals, right? Connect your recruiting metrics to compensation when it comes to your, bringing in different people. Maybe connect with diverse organizations like NSBE and Society of Women Engineers and send them the challenges that you've encountered each month, or weekly, so that those particular communities can know the kind of things that you're dealing with. Try to follow and engage with people who are not like you, people of color, women, non-binary folks, and really kind of listen and be a part of those discussions, maybe on a monthly basis. As an individual, things you can do: shift from saying this mentality of prove me wrong to maybe asking the question of, well, what am I missing? Ask more questions, right? Instead of trying to constantly focus on being right and getting your ideas out there, maybe focus on the group being successful. What are the things that we can do to say, okay, the goal is to solve this problem. Instead of you just doing what I say, how can we focus on being successful? And I know we're running out of time. Yep, go ahead.
All right, sorry. No, I was going to say we're going to go 5 minutes past. There's been great discussion in the chat, not really questions, but I really want you to finish your slides here. So I'll give you 5 more minutes, and then we'll probably wrap up and then take the questions to like the Slack channel or just reach out individually. So with that, we'll just go till 10:05. And
okay,
then,
great.
Kind of have a hard stop, and unfortunately not questions, because I really want you to finish.
No problem. Continue. Yeah, I'm on my last slides. Yeah, thanks. I appreciate that. So in conclusion, right, this is ultimately what we're trying to do. We want to solve difficult problems. We want to think of people, and their abilities as basically, we want a lot of people with a lot of different perspectives, and we want those diverse perspectives as distinct tools. So we want to collect a lot of different tools. And ultimately, we want those team members to efficiently collaborate, right? In order to do that, we have to constantly work on our emotional intelligence. We have to ask more questions versus making more statements in order to kind of get to that point, because it's very difficult to just flip the switch and say, okay, I can now work with people who are different than me and value those differences, value those perspectives, value those experiences as necessary. There are some additional stories that you can definitely click and go through that I think was really helpful in me kind of understanding, especially when it comes to gender diversity. My privilege is I'm a cisgendered heterosexual man. So really kind of listening and going deeper into those who identify as women and really kind of listening to their stories was helpful. So I encourage those who may be similar to me to do that. And thank you at the end of the day for listening. I really appreciate it. The link to my slides are here. And if you want to see kind of all the different, research that I did, I provided links to all the different places that I looked at. So I definitely encourage you to kind of do your own research if you want to go deeper within that perspective. So I finished a little bit before 5 minutes, but I guess do we have a little bit of time for questions or thoughts, or should we go ahead and cut it off, you think?
Well, I want to say two things. One, excellent talk. If you could also put the slides up, or at least a link to the slides on your session page on MidCamp, that would be great.
Absolutely.
But it's great that we can get to them this way. And the second thing is, the reason I'm talking about the session page is, please, everybody that attended, go to the session page and rate this. You can find it by going to the Friday MidCamp, the first session for Fredric Mitchell. Yeah, right here. So at the bottom,
and I pasted the link to the PDF to the slides right here. So.
Oh, there you go. Well, thanks so much for doing that.
No problem.
With that, unfortunately, I'm going to stop the recording and we can continue the conversation for a bit, but another session is going to be starting in about 10 minutes.
Sounds great.
So thanks so much, Fredric, and I'm going to stop the recording.